the most famous joke chess puzzle of the 20th century. It's a checkmate in 3 moves for white, no matter what black plays, and was posed by Tim Krabbe in 1972 in Shark Bulletin. You can solve it by pausing the video, but if you've read the title, you probably already know the punchline. So here's the solution. We start with e7. First, what if black plays d4? Well, we can ignore it and promote our pawn to a queen or to a rook. It's check, so black has to move to either f3 or d3, then we castle that same direction and checkmate the king, creating these 2 elegant checkmates, where white's king perfectly cuts off black's king. If black changes the order, taking on f3 first and then moving the pawn, or playing pawn takes pawn first, the result will be the same. White will finish black off on f3 or d3 by castling as the final move. But there is one more variation, the one that makes this puzzle what it is. What if black takes the pawn with the king and then runs to g2? White must checkmate in just one more move. That's impossible if we promoted to a queen. The rook in the corner is a liability and it just doesn't work. But if we promoted to a rook, well, we've checkmated by castling with this rook and with this rook. So why not checkmate with this rook? We've had O-O and O-O-O. So why not O-O-O-O-O? Checkmate. Vertical castling wins white the game and solves the puzzle. Castling is explained to new players as a move of the king 2 squares towards a rook, with the rook jumping over to the adjacent square. With the added requirements that neither the rook nor the king can have moved, the king is not in check, and that castling would not put the king on or through an attacked square. But nowhere in that explanation does it say you cannot do it vertically. The rook hasn't moved, the king's not in check, and it won't be put in danger by moving to e3. So castling is legal, right? In common belief, as told on Reddit, chess forums, YouTube, and Wikipedia during the last 20 years, this final move, this vertical castling, exploited a real gap in the rules. This wasn't a joke, no. In the 1970s, the rules were poorly written, and this exposed a real gap in how they had been created. Apparently, if allowed to continue, this could be used not just in puzzles, but in real games. One puzzle had exposed an incompetence that the International Chess Federation just had to rush to fix, lest games be infested by this incomprehensible move. So, FIDE changed the rules to clarify that this was not legal. One puzzle had taken on the official rules, and the rules had buckled. Vertical castling was a loophole that just had to be closed. That is an amazing story about an underdog taking on the world of chess, but it is not true. That story, as told on vast parts of the internet and in myth and legend, is just wrong about many of the details. There is no evidence that in the years in question the official rules of castling changed. The relevant 2 rule sets are from 1966 and 1975, and they have the same meaning but in slightly different words. That's because 1966 was written in French first before being translated, and 1975 was written in English first. So inevitably the wording choice is going to change slightly because of that. But the reason they didn't change is really, really simple. Because the second thing the story gets wrong, vertical castling is a joke. It was not allowed in the official rules, not in 1972, not today, and not even in 1928 when the first set of international chess rules were written. I am not the first person to point this out. A few years ago, the original 1928 French rules were made available online, not as a Word document paraphrasing the old rules, but as a PDF scan of the actual book that was written at the time. It's a cool bit of history which, under the section on castling, had the line, "Le roi franchit sur sa ligne de casse," or, "The king moves 2 squares along its own rank." If castling has to happen on the same rank, then it obviously cannot happen vertically. Castling up the board had been outlawed from the rules of chess over 40 years prior to the puzzle's publication, and it stayed illegal under the official rules when they were translated in 1931, updated in 1955, and updated again in 1966. In fact, I haven't found a single example of an official FIDE rulebook that didn't contain the castling stipulation that the king had to stay on the same rank. If all you wanted to know was whether vertical casting was possible, then that is the whole story. It's not now, and it never was. But you might be curious. If vertical casting isn't real, how do we get all those stories? Before I go on, I want to stress that this is about a 50-year-old joke chess puzzle, so please take everything from now on with a dose of whimsy. That being said, if we want to understand the story, we should probably start with some history. That begins in 1907 when a Danish guy called Konrad Staalgaard made this puzzle for Danish chess magazine Skakbladet. It's a mate in two and in this video, so I think you can probably solve it. E8 equals rook, and we checkmate with a vertical castle. This two-mover was only rediscovered by the German magazine Die Schwalbe in 2013, hence why it's not very well known. But because of this, in some places vertical casting is called Staalgaard casting, particularly in German language publications. In 1915, there was also another trickier puzzle by Joseph Kump. These early two puzzles may have actually been valid under the prevailing rules at the time, because before the rules agreements in 1928, there were quite a lot of small discrepancies in the ways rules were worded. So these two may well have been onto something. They may even be part of the reason that FIDE included that same rank stipulation in the first place in 1928. Then the trail goes dead for 50 years until the late 1960s, when American master Edward Formanek showed a joke chess puzzle of vertical casting to Grandmaster Andrew Soltis in 1968. Then, Soltis wrote about that puzzle in 1972 in an article in Chess Life and Review magazine. Also, the Frenchman Jean-Luc Serret made this puzzle of a similar idea in 1971 for a puzzle competition. And then finally we get to Tim Krabbe's 1972 puzzle published in Shark Bulletin. Krabbe learned about vertical casting from his friend Max Pam, and Krabbe liked it and composed the puzzle. So, in a lot of places that aren't German, vertical casting is often called Pam-Krabbe casting, because this is the puzzle that became the most famous. Now, that's 3 supposedly independent puzzles in 4 years, all featuring vertical casting, 2 of which predate the one that gives vertical casting its name. That kind of sounds suspicious at first. But before we get accusatory, there's a reasonable explanation. There are probably far more unpublished vertical casting puzzles that people shared for fun at chess events and tournaments than just these 3 puzzles. The idea probably just became relatively common via word of mouth. Krabbe might have thought that Max Pam came up with the idea all on his own, but it's likely that Pam was influenced by someone else. We don't know who. It could have been from Serret's 1971 puzzle, or it could have been from some random bloke at a chess tournament. It's highly unlikely that these were all independent, but that's not nefarious. It's just how ideas spread sometimes. After Krabbe's article was published, there were a number of other Dutch and Belgian articles that debated the validity of vertical casting. Eventually, it was agreed by economists that vertical casting was not a legitimate move under the rules. In 1974, Krabbe published Schack Curiosa, Chess Curiosities, in Dutch. According to fairly reliable later writing, in the 1972 article, and again in the 1974 book, Schack Curiosa, Krabbe misquoted the rules. He left out the crucial stipulation that the king and rook had to be on the same rank for castling. This wasn't repeated when the book was remade in English in 1985. The source of the myth would have to be the lesser read Dutch version. I know this because I asked Tim Krabbe and he sent me the section from the English version of Chess Curiosities, and nowhere does it say that the rules change, but it does kind of imply it, and we'll get to that later. Then there's a gap to the earliest internet publication in 2006 that I can find when an article in German Wikipedia was made to talk about vertical casting. And it contained the incorrect claim that vertical casting was legal in the 1970s, and that the rules changed subsequently. I'm almost certain that's not where the claim comes from, but it is the earliest source I can still find on the internet. So somehow, somewhere between 1985 and 2006, this myth was born. It cannot have been directly from Schack Curiosa, because the person who made that German Wikipedia article had not read that book at the time, meaning they had to have learned it from somewhere else. To give the article writer credit, they have been very persistent in correcting and updating this article, and are one of the reasons we now know that vertical casting was not allowed in the 1970s. Also, they, a German speaker, went to some length and expense to eventually acquire the Dutch book, which typically goes for 500 plus euros online, so I think we can forgive them if they accidentally have spread in misinformation in the past. What's weird is, that in 1976, Crabbe published this article, which we can still read in Chess Life and Review magazine. It covers Serre, that's the French guy from 1971. In it, he points out that vertical castling isn't legal, and in fact implies it was never legal. That contradicts what he is meant to have said just 2 years prior. People have said that this was a publicity stunt or a deliberate hoax, but the real reason is probably a little bit more ridiculous. It was meant originally as a joke, but it probably didn't get read that widely in 1972, and so Crabbe put the same joke in his book in 74. Later, he realised this maybe wasn't such a good idea, so in subsequent writings he tried to make it clear that vertical castling wasn't a real chess loophole. But, putting it politely, Crabbe's corrected book section from 1985 is not perfect. He included the line, "The FIDE rules nowadays do not talk of a rook, but either rook on the same rank," which implies that there had been a change between 1972 and 1985. This correction of the record arguably throws more fuel on the fire for the second part of the myth, the idea that the rules changed. Whatever the intention, between these books many people had got confused and the informational damage was done. 20 more years later, in the early 2000s, the internet arrives, the myth lands on Wikipedia, and it just takes off from there. There is one more mystery about vertical castling. Why did it take so long to debunk? It stayed around verifiably online for around 15 years until 2021. That's because old versions of the rules were not actually very plentiful online. The French version of the rules from 1928 were uploaded in 2021 to Wikimedia, and whilst we had the 1931 British translation, it's hosted on a website that is not exactly well advertised or easy to find. But it turns out a shocking number of people researching old versions of the rules in English do use this random English website. And whilst it's almost complete, it's missing one version of the FIDE rules. 1966. The very rules that Formanek, Serre, and Pau and Crabbe made their puzzles under. So fully debunking the story provided a bit more of a challenge. Fortunately, we now have secondary sources that contain the official rules, like Kenneth Hawkins' books in the USA, who published editions in 1967 and 1970, but these require some digging to find. I mean, I only found these after seeing the book referenced in old versions of Chess Life and Review. A lot of places have now cleaned up their records on vertical castling. Wikipediarians have quite dramatically rejected the myth in recent years across most languages, and every time someone claims that vertical casting was real in the 70s on Reddit or on chess.com forums, they quickly get met by someone correcting them. However, if there are two places that haven't corrected themselves, it's YouTube and TikTok. The only reason I'm even making this video was because the most common comment on my last video was, "You forgot vertical castling." That is the whole story, but there are random bits of research I really want to share. The magazine that Crabbe wrote this in, Shark Bulletin, the predecessor to what is now New in Chess magazine, has a Wikipedia page in exactly one language, and that language is Breton. And I don't know how that happened, but I find it really funny. I end on these light-hearted notes because, despite the serious tone of all this, it's ultimately about a literal joke, and that's Crabbe's interpretation of the puzzle too. And there are random textbooks from the 90s, like this one from the Scouts, that don't write the rules very precisely and would, read verbatim, arguably allow vertical castling. To the average chess player, it still works as a fun party trick, as long as no one claims that it was a real loophole in the FIDE rules. Thanks for watching.